there, thank you so much again for joining me on this channel. As always, I'm very grateful for all your previous views, likes, subscriptions and shares. I thought today we'd spend time looking at the relationship between religion and morality. And if you've endured these videos before, you know it's not going to be a particularly deep look into it. It's just try to give you like a helicopter view of some of the ideas, and will hopefully you can use it as a springboard into investigating these ideas further. So broadly speaking, there are three views or three approaches to looking at the relationship between religion and morality. First of all, a viewpoint is that you could argue that morality depends upon religion. So think about the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments that were given to Moses and the Hebrews. Okay, a very direct connection there, sometimes referred to as the divine command theory. So the idea that a group of people will know how to behave because of the rules that were given to them, either through a direct religious experience or revealed through a holy text. The second viewpoint is that, well, is actually morality entirely independent of religion? Okay, so in other words, you have people in the world who are not religious, okay, but have moral views and can do just as healthily strong as those with a religion. And then you have the third approach, which is where morality is absolutely opposed to religion. In other words, that maybe the fact that having a religious belief holds humanity back in some way. Now, of course, there are bleeding and blurs between those particular categories, and they may sort of smudge into each other, but roughly speaking, it's a good starting point. So in terms of thinking about morality and religion, what are some of the issues? Well, I've just bundled the three together and we'll just see where it takes us. Well, I think one thing to consider is that some religions have rules that must be obeyed out of fear of punishment. So I was thinking about those kind of medieval times where, in particular, the church in Europe had a huge influence, and people were genuinely scared of going to hell. Okay, now obviously it was a form in many ways of kind of state control and the church exerting its authority. But I think it's also interesting to think about, well, even today, people have very strong religious and devout faiths, and they might be scared of not following the rules. But it's interesting, isn't it? With such religious pressure, can a person be truly free or indeed moral? If they feel hemmed in by these expectations of their religious tradition, then does it actually make them autonomous and free thinking? Now, of course, you can get into very interesting discussions about free will. Well, of course, people generally are free to choose their religion. But if you're perhaps raised in a religious household and a religious tradition, well, and you're used to it, have you been exposed to all the different kind of possibilities? So it gets into the real nitty-gritty there. I think another thing to be aware of too is how different religions often have different approaches to moral issues. Now, it's not to say that all religions are the same. I would argue personally that many religions are concerned with the same themes. So be that the sanctity and of life. It might be, for example, social justice. But there are some moral issues where they can differ. So when it comes to looking at the religions, some of them do approach these things differently. So, for example, even in the same religion, you might have some Christians who say it's acceptable for women to be in leadership, perhaps in the Protestant tradition, but in, for example, the Roman Catholic tradition, women are not there to be involved in the leadership of the church. Okay, so that can be a bit confusing, can't it? Not just for those believers perhaps in that tradition, but from outsiders looking in. And if you have different religions having different approaches to moral issues, that can be a little confusing, because you would kind of think that actually having moral clarity would be an advantage of being in a religion. I think the other aspect as well, which really intrigues me, is how God's powers mean I'm not responsible. So think of it a bit like this. If there is an all-powerful, all-knowing God, I cannot be responsible for my own moral actions, is a possible argument. Think of it a bit like this. If I was to go out there and to commit a crime, okay, then why didn't God stop me? Okay, now a response might be, well, yes, God is all-powerful, but the reason why he didn't stop you was because he wants you to have free will and choice. But my crime could well end up hurting someone quite seriously. So if God didn't stop that, does that mean that God didn't really love that person? In other words, can God actually be all loving? And what you have is this conundrum, a paradox, as it were, because if God is all powerful and all loving and doesn't actually, stop these bad things from happening, then does that mean I'm actually morally responsible for the things that I do? Another aspect of this as well is to think about how religion has permeated into people's lives so much, and actually, can people escape from the influences of religion, values and attitudes? Okay, is there an unconscious effect? So I've got an image here of where we used to live, and there's a church. It sort of dominated the village where I lived. But what's kind of interesting as well, and of course at Christmas lots of people would go, and it kind of had like an unconscious effect because it was Christmas and people would go to the church service. But does religion have an unconscious effect that we're not aware of? And actually, do some of its values seep into society without even being recognised? I think what's also interesting as well is how religion has supplied the language of ethical debate. Words like good, for example, have origins in the word God. We just think about how when we're discussing what is right and what is wrong, a lot of that can be attributed to religion. But I think another aspect of looking at the relationship between religion and morality is how religion provides people with the courage or conviction to actually put it into effect. So think about, for example, Gandhi, from the Hindu faith, and his whole process of ahimsa, non-violence, using, and being inspired by the Hindu faith to overthrow the British Empire through the whole process of non-violence. A staggering achievement. Now, I think it is important to say that, of course, you have people who are not religious who have courage and conviction. That's just as important. I think one of the arguments that people are putting forward is how religion can often inspire people. But of course, you don't need to be religious to be inspired, or indeed inspiring. One of the interesting things as well, I was thinking about religion and relationship with morality, is how philosophers often assume that everyone is reasonable. So often thinking about how the thought process, we are autonomous human beings, we can think things through and come up with conclusions. It's quite interesting actually that religion tends to start off with another viewpoint, which is that by contrast, humanity is somehow flawed or frail in some way. And I guess you could take this in a number of ways. I'll pick two. You could say, for example, that's a negative thing. You could say, well, just to say that human beings are somehow weak or flawed in some way, it feels like a bit of a downer. But another view could be that actually that's kind of refreshing because we're not perfect, and that actually makes us more human. We are human in our frailties and gives us more of an equal starting point. And I think what's also fascinating as well is building on this idea of language, and I suppose we're going into the idea of also the conscience, is that many would argue we have an intuitive sense of the word good, and this intuition lies behind both the ideas and practice of religion, that we have this internal barometer, and whether it's something that is God-given, so Cardinal Newman, for example, talked about how the conscience is a gift from God, or maybe it's something that's evolved through the way that we act within each other. We understand that making social bonds is an advantage, an evolutionary advantage. But it is interesting, isn't it, about how this intrinsic willingness to perhaps want to help others, this empathy. Now, some may say it's God-given, others would say no. The hard-nosed evolutionist would say actually it's not. It comes through our social interactions, and of course on that scale there'll be views in between. That's just something to be aware of. I think what's also interesting as well is how religion and morality often have a common source in mystical experience, moments of awareness, well-being and acceptance. I was watching the movie Soul the other day, which is a fantastic piece of work. I'll probably need to do some work on that for another time on this channel. But there's a moment where we talk about being in the zone, and in the zone is when somebody is doing a hobby or they're working, and they just find everything flows. They just find that everything is as it should be. Maybe you've had a similar experience, and it's where the spiritual meets the physical. Okay, and there is something about that, isn't there, whereby maybe we talk about it in religions, about people having mystical experiences, experiencing miracles, but actually these huge collective moments can happen in the secular world as well. That sort of common humanity, that bond, that human spirit, where everybody is drawn together and everybody supports each other. And that's very powerful as well, isn't it? And I think that's the thing about relationships, okay, that we are, we need each other, and we need to be each other to support. There's a fantastic theologian called Thomas Aquinas, and in his great work, Summa Theologica, which is a summary of theology, he came up with this observation. And he observed that therefore there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness and every other perfection, and this we call God. He was looking at how everything has a sense of goodness about it, and he sort of likened to God being that ultimate source of goodness, a bit like when you have a fire. So when a fire is there in the hearth, maybe a bonfire, or maybe you've got one of those wood burners at home, it's really, really warm, and the closer you are to it, the warmer it feels. Okay, and that's what Aquinas was saying, is that God is a bit like that, a source of goodness. Okay, and the closer you get, the warmer you are. Okay, and the closer you are, the more good you feel. But it doesn't matter how far you are away from God, okay, there is still that little bit of residual goodness within everybody, which is a kind of optimistic way of thinking about things, isn't it? But what's also intriguing as well is how religion has different structures. Okay, so here's the Dalai Lama, who is an important figurehead in Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, but he has a different role in terms of being a leader, as to say the Pope in the Roman Catholic tradition, or a rabbi running a synagogue. And when you have all these different aspects of authority, okay, it can get a bit confusing. So let's say you're at your religious place of worship, and you have someone in, and you hear someone speaking something from your holy book, and they say, well, clearly you need to do X, but then next week someone might come along, okay, in your place of worship and say, well, now you need to do Y, and you might have two different views, and that can get a bit confusing. But I think what's also interesting as well is how the secular world might look to the religious world for moral teaching. Not all the time, but sometimes. And sometimes in moments of stress or anxiety or some sort of catastrophe, religions can be moved front and centre. Okay, and thinking about might be the role of social justice is a very important one. Religious aid organisations are numerous and can be very helpful in terms of accumulating data and getting a real idea of what's going on in the world around. But I think what's also interesting as well is that we often have high expectations, don't we, of those in religious authority, which brings its pressure as well. But if we are looking to our religious leaders for some kind of sense of balance and sense of direction, okay, then perhaps rightly so, we expect them to have that greater sense of moral responsibility. Just to finish with a couple of quotes. First of all, there was F.C. Copperton who said, I do think that all goodness reflects God in some way and proceeds from him. So this notion that God is goodness and everything flows from him. But I do like to finish with this Bertrand Russell one, who says, and I do like this quote very much, I love the things that I think are good. I hate the things I think are bad. I don't say these things are good because they participate in the divine goodness. And what Bertrand Russell is getting at is saying, well, look, there are some things that are good, and I just think they are good. And there are just things in the world that are just bad, and they're just bad. They don't need to be attached to a God up in the sky. And actually, I think that's quite profound, isn't it? That there is this notion that there are some actions out there, there are some bad actions, there are some good actions that no matter where you are in terms of religion, in terms of believing in God or not believing in a God, that you can actually agree on. So I shall leave that there. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, enjoy your learning.